Germany began the Second World War with one of the most sophisticated military machines ever assembled. The Wehrmacht's general staff traced its lineage back to the Prussian reformers of the 19th century, men who had perfected the art of systematic warfare through meticulous planning and professional excellence. These were officers trained in the finest military academies of Europe, schooled in the theories of Clausewitz and Moltke, bred from aristocratic families with centuries of martial tradition in their blood. Yet by 1945, this same military establishment found itself subordinated, humiliated, and in some cases executed by the orders of a former corporal who had never commanded anything larger than a messenger unit in the trenches of the First World War. The question is not whether Hitler distrusted his generals. The question is why a regime that depended entirely on military conquest chose to wage war against its own command structure. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The roots of Hitler's distrust reached back long before the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland. Adolf Hitler had served in the Bavarian army during World War I, not as an officer, but as a Gefreiter, a rank roughly equivalent to lance corporal. He carried messages through shell fire and witnessed the collapse of the Imperial German Army not from the perspective of command, but from the mud. To Hitler, the German defeat of 1918 was not a military failure. It was a betrayal. In his worldview, the army had been stabbed in the back by politicians, communists, and Jews on the home front. But there was another group he quietly blamed, the old Prussian officer class, the aristocrats in pressed uniforms who had directed the war from chateau headquarters hundreds of miles behind the lines. These men, with their von prefixes and inherited estates, represented everything Hitler was not. He was Austrian, middle-class, self-made. They were German, noble, born into privilege. The social gap between Hitler and his generals was not merely professional, it was a chasm of class, culture, and contempt. In the 1930s, as Hitler consolidated power, he needed the military. The Wehrmacht was the only institution in Germany with the organizational capacity and legitimacy to either support or destroy the Nazi regime. Hitler courted the generals carefully. He promised rearmament, the restoration of German military pride, the repudiation of the Versailles Treaty. In return, the officer corps largely acquiesced to his rule, but Hitler did not trust them. He never would. To him, they were relics of a failed system, men bound by outdated codes of honor and Prussian conservatism. And in 1938, he found his opportunity to break their independence. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair was a scandal manufactured with precision. Werner von Blomberg, the Minister of War, married a woman with a police record for prostitution. Werner von Fritsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, was falsely accused of homosexuality by the Gestapo. Both men were forced to resign in disgrace. It was a purge disguised as morality, and it gave Hitler exactly what he wanted. He abolished the position of War Minister entirely and assumed personal command of the Wehrmacht. The OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, was created as Hitler's direct instrument of military control, headed by the compliant General Wilhelm Keitel, a man so servile his peers nicknamed him Lackeitel, a play on the German word for lackey. The OKH, the Army High Command, was left to manage operational details, but ultimate authority now rested with Hitler. The professional military staff, once the backbone of German strategic planning, had been reduced to advisors, and advisors could be ignored. The early years of the war seemed to vindicate Hitler's instincts. Poland fell in 5 weeks. Denmark and Norway were secured in a lightning campaign, and then came France. The German General Staff had initially proposed a conservative plan for the invasion of the West, a modified version of the old Schlieffen Plan that would sweep through Belgium in a broad frontal assault. Hitler rejected it. He wanted something bolder, something that would avoid the stalemate of 1914. The plan that emerged, championed by General Erich von Manstein and supported by Hitler, called for a concentrated armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, a route the French considered impassable for tanks. It was a gamble. Many senior generals opposed it. But Hitler approved, and in May 1940, German panzers broke through at Sedan, raced to the English Channel, and trapped the entire Allied army in a pocket around Dunkirk. France collapsed in 6 weeks. It was the most stunning military victory in modern history. Hitler took the credit. And in his mind, he had earned it. He had overruled the cautious, unimaginative Old Guard and delivered a triumph that even the great Prussian generals of history could not match. From that moment forward, Hitler believed his own instincts were superior to professional military advice. The generals had been wrong, he had been right, and the consequences of that belief would shape every decision for the rest of the war. By the winter of 1941, the Wehrmacht stood outside Moscow, exhausted, frozen, and overextended. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had been launched in June with 3 million men and the largest concentration of armored and air power ever assembled. Hitler had promised his generals that the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks, that the Red Army was a hollow force led by incompetent commissars, that the Slavic peoples lacked the will to resist. The General Staff had warned him. They pointed out the vast distances, the lack of adequate roads, the primitive rail network, the impossibility of supplying a multi-front offensive across 1,000 miles of hostile terrain. Hitler dismissed their concerns. The war, he insisted, would be over before winter. It was not. By December, German forces were within sight of the Kremlin spires, but they could advance no further. The temperature dropped to -40°C. Engines froze, weapons jammed, soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper because their boots had not been designed for Russian winters. And then the Soviets counterattacked. Fresh divisions from Siberia, equipped for winter warfare, slammed into the exhausted German lines. Panicked commanders requested permission to retreat, to pull back to defensible positions, to regroup and consolidate before the army disintegrated entirely. Hitler refused. On December 19, 1941, he dismissed Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch as commander-in-chief of the army and assumed the position himself. He issued a single, uncompromising order: stand fast, no retreats, every soldier would hold his ground or die where he stood. The stand fast order became one of the most debated decisions of the war. Some historians argue it prevented a catastrophic rout, that a retreat in those conditions would have turned into a disorganized collapse like Napoleon's withdrawal from Moscow in 1812. Others point to the staggering casualties, between 248,000 and 400,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in the Battle of Moscow alone, with total Wehrmacht losses for 1941 exceeding 830,000 men. What is certain is that Hitler's faith in his own judgment hardened into dogma. He believed his will had saved the army. The generals who had urged retreat were, in his mind, defeatists and cowards. And from that winter forward, Hitler increasingly ignored military advice that contradicted his own vision of how the war should be fought. The pattern repeated itself with every major campaign. At Stalingrad in 1942, General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army were encircled by a Soviet counteroffensive. Paulus requested permission to break out while there was still time. Hitler refused. He ordered Paulus to hold the city at all costs and promised an airlift to supply the trapped army. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring assured Hitler the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day. The actual deliveries averaged less than 100 tons. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was starving, freezing, and out of ammunition. Paulus surrendered. 90,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. Hitler blamed Paulus for failing to hold. He blamed the Luftwaffe for failing to supply. he did not blame the decision to stand fast in an untenable position. After Stalingrad, Hitler dismissed General Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff, who had repeatedly clashed with him over operational decisions. Halder was replaced by General Kurt Seitzler, who lasted less than 2 years before he too fell out of favor. Hitler began conducting military briefings that stretched for hours, delivered in monologues where no one dared interrupt. His orders became increasingly detached from battlefield reality. Generals who objected were relieved of command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was dismissed in December 1941 for requesting a tactical withdrawal in Ukraine, then reinstated, then dismissed again in 1944. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as Germany's most brilliant operational commander, was removed in March 1944 after repeated disagreements over strategy in the East. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, lost Hitler's confidence after advocating for a flexible defense in Normandy rather than the rigid coastal fortifications Hitler demanded. The German command structure fractured into parallel hierarchies. The OKW controlled operations in the West, North Africa, and Scandinavia. The OKH managed the Eastern Front. The Waffen-SS operated semi-independently. The Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine answered to their own commanders. Coordination became nearly impossible. Intelligence was hoarded. Resources were allocated based on favoritism rather than strategic priority. And at the center of it all sat Hitler, making decisions based on intuition, ideology, and an unshakable conviction that his will could overcome material reality. The question remains, why did the generals tolerate it? Why did men trained in the rigorous logic of military science allow themselves to be overruled by a former corporal with no formal military education? The answers are complex. Some believed in Hitler's vision, convinced that National Socialism represented Germany's only path to greatness. Others were bound by their oath of loyalty, a sacred vow in Prussian military tradition. Many were complicit in the regime's crimes, having overseen or participated in the mass killings on the Eastern Front, and knew they were too deeply implicated to oppose the regime without destroying themselves. Fear played a role as well. The Gestapo monitored the officer corps constantly. Dissent could mean dismissal, imprisonment, or execution. And after the early victories in Poland and France, there was always the lingering possibility that Hitler might be right, that his unorthodox methods might somehow deliver victory despite all logic to the contrary. But some did resist. In July 1944, a group of officers led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb placed under a conference table at his headquarters in East Prussia. The explosion killed 4 men. Hitler survived. The conspirators were hunted down, tortured, and executed. Some were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing. The failed assassination attempt confirmed every paranoid suspicion Hitler had ever harbored about his generals. In the aftermath, he purged the officer corps of anyone suspected of disloyalty. The military became even more subordinated to Nazi ideology. Competence mattered less than fanaticism. Generals who promised to hold impossible positions were promoted. Those who advocated realism were dismissed as traitors. By 1945, the Reich was collapsing. Soviet armies closed in from the east. American and British forces advanced from the west. Germany's cities were reduced to rubble by strategic bombing. The Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former strength, filled with old men and boys, equipped with dwindling fuel and ammunition. And still, Hitler refused to allow retreats. He issued orders for counteroffensives that existed only on paper, moving phantom divisions across maps in his Berlin bunker, while the real units had long since been destroyed. His generals, the few who remained, sat in silence during briefings, knowing that any suggestion of surrender or withdrawal would be met with rage and accusations of treason. The professional military staff, once the pride of the German state, had been reduced to functionaries, executing the orders of a man who believed willpower alone could reverse the tide of history. The irony is that Hitler's distrust of his generals became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By micromanaging operations, overruling sound tactical advice, and prioritizing ideological goals over strategic logic, he created the conditions for military disaster. The generals, unable to exercise independent judgment and terrified of making decisions that contradicted Hitler's will, became cautious, reactive, and ineffective. The very qualities that had made the German General Staff formidable, flexibility, decentralized command, the initiative of subordinate officers, were systematically destroyed. What remained was a command structure paralyzed by fear, ideology, and the delusion that loyalty to the Führer was more important than winning the war. The German military did not lose World War II solely because Hitler distrusted his generals. The Reich was fighting a multi-front war against opponents with vastly superior industrial capacity, manpower, and resources. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome those material realities. But Hitler's insistence on personal control over military operations, his refusal to listen to professional advice, and his willingness to sacrifice entire armies to avoid admitting mistakes, accelerated Germany's defeat and multiplied its casualties. Stalingrad, Kursk, the failure to evacuate troops from encirclements, the doomed offensives launched with insufficient forces, these were not the inevitable results of Germany's strategic position. They were the consequences of a command system where one man's judgment overruled all others, and where that man's judgment was catastrophically flawed. After the war, many German generals wrote memoirs blaming Hitler for every defeat while absolving themselves of responsibility. They claimed they had been military professionals forced to serve a madman, that they had advised caution and been ignored, that the great victories were theirs and the disasters were his. This narrative, sometimes called the clean Wehrmacht myth, oversimplifies a far more complicated reality. The generals were complicit. They executed criminal orders. They planned and directed wars of annihilation. They benefited from the Nazi regime when it suited them and distanced themselves from it only after defeat. But it is also true that Hitler's distrust, his insistence on absolute control, and his belief that willpower could overcome material facts destroyed any possibility of coherent military strategy. A regime built on the idea of the infallible leader could not tolerate dissent, even when dissent came from those who best understood how wars are fought. The lesson history teaches is not that dictators always fail. It is that systems which concentrate all authority in one person, which punish honest advice and reward sycophancy, which confuse loyalty with competence, are inherently brittle. They may achieve spectacular successes when circumstances align in their favor. But when reality deviates from the leader's expectations, when the enemy refuses to collapse on schedule, when the map no longer matches the terrain, such systems cannot adapt. They double down. They blame subordinates. They issue orders that cannot be executed and demand miracles as substitutes for strategy. And in the end, they collapse, not because their enemies were stronger, but because they destroyed themselves from within. Hitler did not trust his generals because he did not trust anyone who might challenge his vision of himself as a military genius. He needed to believe that his instincts were superior to their training, that his will was more powerful than their professional judgment, that he alone understood what was necessary to achieve victory. That belief won him France in 1940, and it cost him everything that followed. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.